Thank you, everyone, for coming to the 3-Minute Thesis Preparation Workshop number 1. There is a second workshop, November 19th, also at 5 p.m. on best practices for webcam recording. Please come to that one as well if you can. For tonight's workshop, I'm going to speak a little bit on plain language summarization. Then we will move on to turning your plain language summary into a presentation. The first question, of course, is what exactly is a plain language summary? Plain language is communication that uses non-complex, non-jargony language, and it's also speaking very directly to the audience. So this is the kind of thing that you need to figure out who is your audience, and then what's the level that you want to be communicating at, and what are the ideas that you want to communicate. You are not going to be communicating everything in your thesis. You're going to pick out the most important or most intriguing, maybe the most problematical of the results that you had, depending on what you're actually trying to accomplish. There are many uses for plain language summaries. So I put a plain language summary in my thesis. So it's the last chapter of my thesis. It's just over 2 pages long, and it just explains the background and what I did in a way that I hope is a little bit more accessible to the average audience. One of the main websites for this is the Center for Plain Language, which is just the centerforplainlanguage.org. I will put all these links in the chat, and for anybody who's watching the recording, I'll put them in the description of the video as well. They have a 5 steps suggested procedure. Step 1 is to identify the target audience. You might have more than one target audience. That's something to consider. Or you might not know exactly who the target audience is, but it does help to think of somebody. What do people need to know about your work in order to understand what it is you did and the results that you're presenting? You want to make sure you explain terminology and use as little jargon as possible. But you also need to think about the structure. And one of the pieces of advice that I see a lot on writing plain language is to think about your research in terms of a story. What is the story that you're trying to tell with your research? This has to do with how you're going to structure things, the language that you're going to use, and what you're going to include. And again, it may not be the whole aspect, every aspect of your thesis. There's no way you're going to include all the details, but you really need to focus in on, for this particular presentation, what is the most important thing, what is the most important idea you want to get across. Structure that content, as they say here. Make sure that it flows logically, that you're not jumping around a lot, but you may want to break it up into sections, but those sections need to progress in an obvious fashion. As far as the actual language is concerned, in general, you want to stick to short, not too complex sentences. If you find that your sentences are running on, maybe break it up into a couple of sentences. The standard kind of writing for the web advice of put the important stuff first is another important aspect of this. You do need to present enough detail that everybody can understand what you're talking about, but not so much that your audience is going to drown in detail or that you are going to end up running over time. This is probably the hard part deciding what's important, what details are important in order for somebody to understand this. Hopefully you still love your topic at this point, and you want to tell everybody about everything, but that's not what you're doing here. Just focus in on the key points that you want. You're going to be writing in a more conversational, a more casual tone. This is not going to be formal. It's not going to be heavily scientific. But just remember, it's not dumbed down. That's very important. You're not dumbing down your ideas. You're just simplifying to the key points. I see that a lot in discussions. People talk about writing for your grandma or writing for your 12-year-old nephew or something like that. That's not necessarily what you're doing. You're writing for somebody who's interested in your topic, but maybe doesn't have a huge amount of background in your particular subject. They also recommend using the active voice. So it's not observations were made, but, I made observations, or I observed, even better. Nice active verbs here. You do want to make sure that you're keeping the vocabulary level. Don't make it, clinical. If you're using jargony terms and they're important for you to use, make sure you explain them. Investigate sources. And this is probably where, if you are interested in using AI to help you with this, this is probably where you would do it. You're going to write out what you want to say to begin with, give it to an AI, not necessarily to rewrite, but maybe to comment. You can ask AI chats, the large language models, not to rewrite things, but to comment on them. Something that I've actually found very useful is to give a large language model a text of something I'm going to be presenting, and then tell it that this is going to be presented to an audience of, college students. What kinds of questions might they ask me? That can help you get an idea of where you might have left things out. You can, ask, where can I simplify this? What can I leave out? Ask it questions. Don't ask to rewrite it, because you want it in your voice. That's very important for something like this. This is your work. It needs to be in your voice. But you can ask these things for help. You do want to format your piece if it's going to be presented in the form of text. You will want to format things in a way that breaks everything up into sections, but they do need to be logical sections. They do not have to be the same sections that you have in your actual thesis. In fact, they probably shouldn't be. You don't want a literature review section in your plain language summary. That's probably not necessary. You probably don't need to present a ton of background info. If somebody's really interested, they can go and look at your thesis. If you are going to be presenting this, like I said, in any kind of text format, definitely use headings. Don't crowd too much wordage onto a page. If you're creating a presentation and you're going to have multiple slides, don't stick tons of words onto the slides. That's not the point of this either. You do want to make sure that everything flows logically, and I think is one of the reasons that they often recommend thinking about your work as a story. What is the story of this? Where did the idea come from? How did you investigate it? What did you find? What's important about that? What's the story of how things are working? If you have time, it is very, very useful to get feedback from people. That can be your advisor, but probably it's best to get feedback from somebody who is not familiar with your work. I actually recommend that for just your thesis in general. Before you finalize it, let somebody who doesn't know your work read it. It's very easy to skip things because, well, everybody on my committee knows what I've been doing. And then you leave out some crucial piece because everybody knows it. Or you don't explain something as well as you could, again, because everybody is familiar with what you're doing. It is very, very useful to get an outsider perspective on your work. The Center for Plain Language, their step 5 is to work with target user groups. That may not be possible for something like this presentation to work with a whole lot of people, but you can find somebody to read it over or listen to you present. That's going to be very, very useful. If you look up on the web for how to write a plain language summary, you will get all sorts of these small examples. I just have a few of them because I want to show off a few things. So this one, they took a journal article that had been published and they actually present a plain language summary. I can make this a little bit larger, I think. There we go. So this is still fairly detailed. They do use what we might think of as jargon. So they're talking about spores of plant pathogens, but it is definitely simpler than the abstract. The abstract is micron-sized propagules of plant pathogens. We have to know a lot of vocabulary to understand this, but they've talked about, what is it they're trying to do? Why is it important? Some of which may serve as potential human allergens. Their literature review is boiled down to, however, previous studies have focused only on this one aspect of it, and our experiments show it is shorter than the abstract. In this case, that is not necessarily true. You might, depending on how much you want to explain and how long you have to explain it, your plain language summary could be longer than your abstract. This is just an example where this is a plain language summary of a single article, not an entire thesis. I did want to point out that in this case, they do have tips, which include, again, that tell a story. I do kind of like this if you are a visual person. You may actually find that sketching out something like a storyboard or a mind map or something like that may help you figure out what are the important parts that you want to emphasize. And I definitely like this one. Think of a person you respect or enjoy talking to. Write the summary as though you were explaining your study to that person. So think of a person that you want to explain this to. Not your advisor, not your committee. Somebody who has not been involved in the research up until now. There are tons of examples of plain language summaries on the web. Definitely go and read a few. And I like this last one. Don't rush the process. Write the summary, leave it for a few days, come back to it, read it again. Also from the AGU, they have a very simple, why would you want to do this? And again, I will put all the links to all of these in the chat. It's just hard for me to get to the chat while I'm sharing. And it will also be in the description. And then they have another example. Again, these are for journal articles. So you would expect your thesis plain language summary to be longer. Why do you want to explain your work in plain language? Because more people will read it. That's pretty much the answer. Why do you want to do this? What is it about? What are you talking about? Why are you talking about it? What did you find? Why is it important? Why should the person you're talking to be interested in what you did? Imagine someone asking you, so what? Answer that question. There are various readability apps and websites where you can upload materials and get a readability score of some sort or another. Sometimes that's a grade level. Sometimes it's more of a descriptive. And again, why is this important? Again, I will just go back to mine and just go through how I did this. Now, I didn't structure it, so that's a defect in mine, but I was writing it as a chapter. Why is it important? What is it that I'm doing? I'm doing historical ecology. What is that? What does that do? What did I do? What did I find? What does it mean? What did I find and what does that mean? And what might be kind of the future of the work that I'm doing? Is this important? Why is it important? Where might things go from there? That was pretty much how I structured this. So for me, this is just over 2 pages for a 40-odd page thesis. Without the 2.5 pages, it's less than 40 pages. So 38 pages, and you'll notice I've left it at the end as a question. And that has to do with my thesis, which was exploring, was it possible to do something? Well, yes, it was possible to do it. And so what's the implication of this? What might be the future going forward? So it's meant to be conversational. So I can end this with a question. That's fine. Okay.